Hello, welcome back to Bonaventure Time. Today I am going to actually finally publish an existentialist video. Finally, finish some research I did, further research on the existentialist and kind of trying to narrow down their thought and try to make it as presentable as I can. And so I finally feel like I've done that, and so I'm ready to make this existentialist video. So let's just get right in. Now, existentialism is usually when people hear existentialism, a lot of people think Jean-Paul Sartre. And he undeniably probably is the face of existentialism in some sense. If you read his work, Existentialism is a Humanism, that's probably the most famous of the existentialist works. So he bears the face of existentialism. But the problem with thinking Sartre's like the father of existentialism is really misperceiving what existentialists were trying to do and what is the heart of existentialism. So if you take Sartre, and we'll start with Jean-Paul Sartre, existentialism is a humanism, posits this idea of existence precedes essence. So what it is precedes, or that it is precedes what it is, right? And already you can already see some fundamental errors in regard to the human person, because we're already confusing, once again, person and nature, individual substance with a rational nature. And right, Sartre is saying that that it is precedes what it is. So we're really, again, just confusing nature, and actually, in reality, Sartre's just throwing it away. And he would say that essence is defined by existence and what we do. So we become, and this is a big notion for existentialism. However, it's not as radical as Sartre. But first, Sartre, in this idea of becoming, right, our essence. I do not bear the essence of man. Right, a chair does not bear the essence of chair. But actually there's this state of becoming. And it almost seems to be an adoption sort of Hegel in his phenomenology of spirit, right? In this phenomenology of history, right? Where history's in, there's no like actuality, but history's in a pure state of becoming, right? And man has this free choice to really actualize history, but it's in this pure state of becoming. You almost get that sense with Jean-Paul Sartre in human beings and essences, where essence is just in this pure state of becoming, and it's defined by existence. Now, this is why I think it's an error to put Jean-Paul Sartre as the heart of existentialism, because not all existentialists believe this idea, that essence is defined by existence. A lot of them will, a lot of the later ones, and especially Sartre's contemporaries, but not all of them do, and especially not the founder of existentialism. So that's why I say it's just a danger and a misconception to say Sartre is the father of existentialism. So existentialism is a humanism. That's a lot of fun words. Is probably Sartre's most famous work. Man. If not, it's probably Being and Nothingness. I have already addressed part of this in a video I made on Stein's theory of empathy versus Sartre's theory of the look. And if you want more details on the theory of the look, I would go check out that video. I will not really address the theory of the look because I addressed it in that video. But that is a very famous theory that Sartre comes up with, on this idea that we are both subject and an object, but we can't be both simultaneously. So those are two famous works for Sartre, and certainly for existentialism. Existentialism is a humanism, and Being and Nothingness. Now, though Sartre is not the father of existentialism, in him there are key ideas and terms that are very core, or central, I should say, to the existentialist philosophy. And those terms are nothingness, existence, although that's a term that's been around for quite a while, but it takes on a different notion for the existentialists. Right, nothingness, I just mentioned. There's the philosophical problem that we philosophers like to argue about, is like, can you define nothingness? Because once you define nothingness, it becomes something, and it's the contrary of what it is, nothing. But you can't even say that, right? You can't add the verb is, right? And so nothingness is not derived in that sense for the existentialists, and I will talk about this in this video. Another big idea is freedom. We already talked about becoming, that's a big deal, but freedom also becomes something as well, and it's in relation to nothingness for the existentials. And to expand on these ideas of freedom, and nothingness, I want to turn first to Simone de Beauvoir, and then I'll go back in time to the founder of existentialism and to other existentialist philosophers. Now, Simone de Beauvoir is an existential phenomenologist, which was very common for her time, right? The 19th and 20th century philosophers adopted both the movement of phenomenology and the movement of existentialism. And so there's very similar ideas where there's a priority of the subject in his consciousness. And the reason why that is because nothingness for the existentialist is this idea of a self-awareness of one's capacity to be able to do something. So this self-consciousness, right, this coming out of his existence in some sense of wanting to be there, and this pure sort of idealistic transcendental phenomenology that you might find in Husserl's ideas, perhaps more radical though in Beauvoir, where it's certain coming out of his existence, the Sein, as we'll see in another philosopher. And so that is nothingness for the existential. It's not this idea that it's right the opposite of something or of that philosophical notion. It's this idea of self-consciousness, self-awareness, and the coming out of existence. Now, for Beauvoir, and how this really relates for her, she uses this in an existential ethics. And if you're familiar with existentialism, you're already going to know that this is dangerous. If you're familiar with Beauvoir, you would already know that this is dangerous. I want to kind of explain the premise of this, a very surface level premise, and then we'll talk about why it's dangerous, if it is at all. So existential ethics for Beauvoir really centers around this theory of ambiguity for Beauvoir. And this idea of ambiguity, and you'll see this is in relation to Sartre, her contemporary, it deals with, on one side of a coin, we have the subject, we have freedom, the freedom to make choices. On the other side of this coin, we have object, namely, we are objects and made objects for others. And this is in relation to, Sartre's theory of the look. Again, if you want more detail on that, I would go check out the video I made of Stein and Sartre. So, subject on one side, object on another. Freedom on one side, facticity on the other. And this is a theory of ambiguity. Now, Beauvoir says we need to embrace this ambiguity, right? We need to embrace this idea of nothingness, right? And have this self-awareness and coming out of existence to choose freedom. But for her, freedom is not this abstract thing attributed to just every human intrinsically. It's only something in concrete projections in particular circumstances. That's what freedom is for her. And that's how it relates to nothingness. Now, that should be setting off a lot of alarm bells for any Catholic moral philosopher or moral theologian. And they would notice that this basically gives a philosophy or is related to a philosophical movement that became big in the 20th century and certainly stemmed from a utilitarian attitude. And this is the idea of situational ethics. And situational ethics posits that nothing is really, it kind of is similar to Peter Abelard, or all the way back in the medieval times. And what it is there's no moral absolutes. Everything has to be taken within its context, within its situation, right? And everything, and Beauvoir would hold this, everything, there's no value to an action, there's only value in the intention of the subject, right? In this idea of freedom, in this idea of nothingness, this coming out, this self-awareness of consciousness, the value of my intention projected upon this ethical action is only when an action takes on value. And that's why she says there's only particular circumstances in which freedom is attributed to, the full idea of freedom. And that's really the heart of that. It is situational ethics. And that's a huge problem because if you're rejecting moral absolutes, you reject, if you dive into the realm of natural law and the Ten Commandments, reject that as a natural basis. There's no such thing as natural law then. And this really stems in a way from utilitarianism, where it's this idea where ends justify the means, and it's really this idea of stressing the intention over the object and circumstance. Or really just an emphasis of circumstance and intention and excluding the object, right? This principle of plenitude that we have in the Catholic moral theological field. That is Beauvoir, and that's an existential ethics for her. That would be one of her more famous works. Another one, The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir, it deals with really the modern gender theory and the topic of femininity. This is a very controversial work because Beauvoir is going to argue in this work that actually females are not, there's no essence of female, right? Adopting this sort of Sartre existentialism. And she's also going to say they're only relative to man. There's only female relative to male. And the reason she holds this is this idea that, and if you thought experiment with me here, there's two poles. There's the pole of masculinity and there's the pole of femininity. And there's this middle ground in between them. And there's these sociological norms in which women adopt from man in this middle ground, right? And you can see this in the idea, with the exception of some areas, but more on a majority level, where women wear pants, right? But men don't wear skirts, right? So there's this sociological norms that women partake in relative to man, but it does not go the other way. And so Beauvoir really develops this idea of relativity of femininity to masculinity. And this creates a problem because for her, she develops this sort of Marxist theory of oppression, that the female is oppressed, they don't know that they're oppressed, and it goes into the whole idea of rejecting the patriarchy, right? Something interesting in Beauvoir's text of The Second Sex is she does say that the female seeks transcendence through the male. It's not so much like a gender complementary nature where you'd find in the Catholic area. It's more along the lines of utilitarian. But it is interesting. She does posit that the female does seek transcendence through the male. But probably the most controversial statement Beauvoir makes towards the end of the book is that motherhood actually prevents females from becoming what it really means to be female. And this is addressed really, really hard. I can't think of the word I wanted to say, but this is addressed in Stein's essays on woman, where really the premise of her book is what is the nature of woman is it cannot be divorced from motherliness. And that's why Stein will continually refer to the Blessed Mother as the source and image of woman, as well as this complementary nature that we find, right, in Genesis, in the Imago Dei. So Stein really, there's really not really a compare and contrast, but really just a contrast you can make in Stein's essays on woman and Beauvoir's The Second Sex. But we're not talking about Stein, unfortunately, today. We're talking about the existentialist, and that is what Simone de Beauvoir would say. So we've talked about Sartre in this existentialism is a humanism, being in nothingness, Simone de Beauvoir, existential ethics, and her theory of ambiguity, and then also her text, The Second Sex. Now, there is actually two more existentialist philosophers that I wanted to do research on. And I did say I was going to make this earlier, and one of the philosophers I wanted to do more research on was Martin Heidegger. I'm not as familiar with his philosophy, and so that's the reason why I've been postponing this video. I want to become more acquainted with Heidegger because he really has some important words linguistically in the German language that really kind of help illuminate the founder of existentialism and his ideas and the concept of anxiety. So, before we get to the founder, who is personally my favorite of the existentialists, I want to talk about Martin Heidegger. Heidegger develops this concept of anxiety. Now, this is not really original. He's kind of copying and pasting from the founder of existentialism, but treating Heidegger's concept in a linguistic way and kind of unfolding through the German expressions is very helpful for understanding. So, this concept of anxiety is not something that we're going to think of in terms of fear or just a big radical notion of fear. No, anxiety is actually a fundamental good for Martin Heidegger. And for him, though, there's some terms that need to be clarified in understanding this concept. And we talked about nothingness, right? This self-awareness, this self-consciousness. This becomes prevalent in the concept of anxiety. But also existence, and I mentioned it earlier, but for Heidegger, he calls this the Dasein in German. And that means, right, to be there, or in a more expressive way, it means wanting to be there. And this becomes interesting, and actually kind of helps me understand the founder's concept of anxiety more through the German of Heidegger, because this concept deals with this idea that we're in the Dasein, right? We're in existence, right? it's there. You posit its existence. It is wanting to be there. Anxiety, what it is it's this moment of contemplation of my being able to, my capacity to be able to, right? There's the idea of freedom and nothingness. And when I come to this idea of this being able to, I come out of my existence. And I feel what Heidegger calls the Unlümlichkeit, the Unhumlichkeit. Forgive me if I'm not pronouncing that totally correct. That's the German for unhomeliness. That is the feeling of anxiety, right? It's not just this radical fear, but it's actually this feeling of unhomeliness, this disposition of nothingness, right? Whereas existence, and I think this is expressive in the German, the wanting to be there, we have the anxiety, this unhomeliness feeling. But again, Heidegger just says that this is a fundamental good for the human person, this feeling of being able to, the capacity of being able to, contemplating this. And the reason he says that is because for him, fear is different from anxiety in that fear has a direct correlate or something that it's determinately fearing, right? So arachnophobia, for example, is the fear of spiders. There's a determinate factor in that. For Heidegger, the concept of anxiety is actually does not have a determinate factor. He says it is indeterminate. So if you take, for example, the example that someone's anxious about getting a job, right? And this is a very common one, or some big decision coming up in life. Heidegger would say, you're not anxious about the job. You're anxious about this idea that no one else can will you to get this job. No one else can force you or can take the job for you, right? Or if I'm anxious about, right, a wedding day coming up, no one else can marry the other person for you, right? Right? So there's this idea that there is no determinate factor. It's really, again, this contemplation of my own being able to. And that's the sense of unhomeliness, where you almost feel alone, right? There's the idea of nothingness. But the reason it's good is because once you accept this sort of incommunicability, right? It's a fancy term in philosophy, which means that it's something that's not shared among others. Once you embrace this concept of anxiety, there comes the freedom, right? This freedom to choose, and you have this sense of restored peace that comes in, right? Once you embrace this good that is anxiety, peace comes in because you've accepted, right, this choice of freedom. That is the concept of anxiety for Martin Heidegger. And I actually think it's a really neat concept, but it's not really original to Heidegger. And this is the last last existentialist we'll talk about. And this is Søren Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard is actually attributed to be the founder of existentialism. And probably the greatest work he did, or at least one of his most famous ones, was the concept of anxiety. He's the one who really founded this concept. Heidegger's really copying and pasting it. But again, I talk about it from more his lens because I really feel like the German expressions really kind of help illuminate the concept. But Kierkegaard was really the founder of this idea. And I won't re-explain it because it's, again, copy and paste between him and Heidegger. But I will talk about the example he uses for this concept of anxiety. For him, he uses Genesis. And he uses Adam as an example. For Kierkegaard, he says Adam in the garden, he's created and then there's creation. Now, the big turning point for Adam, and this is a big point in phenomenology, and this actually becomes a big point for John Paul II in Theology of the Body, is when God says, do not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And why this is a big deal is because man learns a certain subjectivity of himself. He learns that he is able to do this. He never contemplated that before, right? There is this tree, and there's this tree that he could eat, but he's never contemplated, right, this idea that he can eat of this tree or he can't eat of this tree, right? He has the ability to choose to eat of this tree, right, and the ability to not eat of this tree, that free will, right? And Kierkegaard notices this and deems it the first time of anxiety. I almost said ambiguity. That would be a horrible mistake. Anxiety. Because Adam is contemplating his being able to. He's not suggesting that Adam is sinning and thinking, I am going to eat of this tree. But for once, Adam realizes that he is able to make this decision, that if he ate of this tree, no one else could make him do it, right? Then that's a interesting point, especially if you take a look in the ethical field of the harmony of intention, object, and circumstance, which I think Beauvoir really overlooks. But I think Kierkegaard kind of has a deeper, more understanding of that and keeping them all in harmony, at least on a more surface level view, perhaps not more in depth. But I think that's interesting for Kierkegaard in making this analogy with Adam, because it is a big point for Adam to really contemplate that this being able to. And in a sense, you could almost think about it in your own, right, in our own lives, right? This example of only I can do this, or no one can, like, not the sense of pride, but more just the sense that, right, no one can will for you, right? That's what incommunicability means. No one can will for you, right? If I want to love another, if I want to will the good for another, no one else can force my love upon them, right? No one else can will the good for them on my behalf, right? And I think this is really interesting that Kierkegaard takes this notion and it attributes it to anxiety. And there's, I think, some things we can take, and some things that should be clarified before we kind of make some final remarks. And a thing that should be clarified is this is very, and you especially see this in Heidegger, idealistic. And it's not as much grounded in a sort of objectivity. And this is what the existentialists are very critiqued for, is their loss of the sense of reality. And I think this is a fair critique to make, not just on the level of Jean-Paul Sartre, but also on Heidegger and even a bit of Kierkegaard. But I think a thing to remember, too, is also Kierkegaard, he's a psychologist. Heidegger, in phenomenology, was also a psychologist. So was Beauvoir. And so was Jean-Paul Sartre, and you'll see many other existentialists who were psychologists. And so I think that's another thing to recognize, is that, they're not really trying to go on a quest of metaphysics, which is a common critique. And again, I do think it is justified. But that wasn't really their journey that they're setting out on. They were really exploring the psychology of man and the idea of nothingness and the subjectivity of man. And I think that at least Kierkegaard, if you want to disagree with others, I would certainly disagree with Existential Ethics by Beauvoir and Existentialism as a Humanism. But I think this concept of anxiety actually provides great reflection when you think about it, and on a psychological notion, because I think it really is a peaceful notion, because Kierkegaard's not saying that there's a right answer in a sense because he's exploring psychology. He's really asking, like, what's the question I need to ask, right? This being able to, there's no determinate factor, right? It's not a question of really the right answer, but it's a question of asking the right question, which I think is an interesting thing in psychology. And I think it's actually a helpful thing. Now, when I want to clarify, when I say that there is no right answer, it's not about the right answer. It's not saying abandon reality, which perhaps the existentialists do, even Kierkegaard. But it's more the sense of sometimes we, in our perfectionism, and I especially see this in myself because I'm a perfectionist, right, strive for just the right answer and this idea of I won't because I can't, because that's the perfect way to do it. Whereas this idea of no, I won't because I won't, right? There's this quote that the psychologist has, and I like it. He says, don't ever bother trying to be in control of your life, but bother trying to be in charge of your life. And there's a stark difference there. And that can apply in a Christian life as well, right? Because we don't have control, right? God is in control. But God asks us to take charge. God asks us to take action, right? He doesn't ask us to just be mediocre and sit around. And I think Kierkegaard and his concept of anxiety kind of touches upon this a bit. And you can attribute this idea to Kierkegaard's concept. This idea of taking charge in this concept of anxiety when we contemplate our being able to do something and embracing that and taking charge. And then we see that peace comes, right? We see that peace comes when we take charge because, right, we aren't in control, right? God is in control, right? This unhomeliness we feel in this idea of anxiety brings home this peace. And when we embrace it, because we're not supposed to be here. Now, that's not something Kierkegaard or Heidegger would say themselves, but I think as Catholics, we can expand upon this idea of anxiety and really add that in and say, yeah, we should embrace anxiety embrace the peace, because this isn't our home. We should feel a level of unhomeliness. And when the peace comes, right, it should make us want to go back into this earth that is our temporary home and strive towards the eternal home. That, again, is not an existentialist view. That is more, I think, a view as Catholics we can add to this. But I certainly think the concept of anxiety is worthy of reflection. And so I'll end this video with that. So those are the 4 existential philosophers I wanted to present. And I think they really give a great surface level and introduction to existentialism as a movement in philosophy. It's a dangerous movement, but I think it's a very interesting movement and intriguing. And I should say that Kierkegaard is not like Sartre and thinks becoming is a change of essence. Becoming for him is more of moving towards the final end. And you see that in his concept of anxiety. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Please like it. If you haven't already, please subscribe. Check out any other videos on medieval and Wojtyła and phenomenology if you're interested. And I hope to see you next time. God bless.